The first thing I remember is the cold. Not just the kind that seeps into your skin when winter winds cut through your clothes, but the kind that makes you feel invisible. The kind that tells you no one cares whether you shiver or burn. I was 12 years old the day my father threw my only winter coat into the trash can outside, his voice sharp as the ice on the ground. "Stop whining. Toughen up. Life doesn't hand you blankets," he barked. His breath steamed in the air, but his body was warm beneath the heavy jacket he always wore. I stood there in the driveway, trembling, watching the one thing keeping me from freezing sink into a pile of garbage like it was nothing. That day wasn't just about a coat. It was about what I meant to him. Less than scraps, less than the trash he stepped on without looking back. My name is Caroline, and I'm 28 years old now. I live alone in a small but warm apartment, with radiators that hiss through the night and thick blankets folded neatly at the edge of my bed. People sometimes ask why I'm so careful about keeping the heat on, even when bills are high. They don't know that for me. Warmth has never been just about comfort. It has always been about survival, about proving that I would never again stand in the snow with bare arms, begging for mercy from a man who believed pain was the best teacher. I grew up in a house where love was measured out in rations, and I was always last in line. My sister, Grace, was 2 years younger than me, but somehow carried the crown from the day she was born. My father adored her, my mother shielded her, and I became the shadow trailing behind. Grace was the one who got the birthday parties, the new shoes, the hugs at bedtime. I got hand-me-downs that didn't fit and silence when I asked why. When Grace wanted a toy, my father drove her to the store, wallet ready. When I asked for help with school projects, he scoffed and told me to figure it out myself. "That's how you learn," he'd say, though the only thing I learned was that asking him for anything was a mistake. The coat had been the only gift my grandmother ever gave me directly. It was thick, navy blue, with big brown buttons and a hood lined in fake fur. She handed it to me one Christmas with a smile that made me feel, for once, like I mattered. I wore it everywhere, clinging to the sense that someone cared whether I stayed warm. My father hated it. He said I looked spoiled, like I thought I was better than the rest of the family. One morning, when the temperature dropped so low the windows in our house frosted over, I reached for my coat on the hook by the door. It was gone. I found it outside, stuffed into the trash can like rotten food. My father stood nearby, arms crossed, watching me discover it. "You don't need that crutch," he said. "Cold builds character. You'll thank me someday." I never thanked him. I only felt the cold on my skin in my chest, wrapping around my heart until it hardened. That winter, I walked to school in sweaters that did little to block the wind. Grace walked beside me in a brand new parka, pink and fluffy, the kind of coat kids admired on the playground. She twirled in it, laughing, while I tried to pretend my teeth weren't chattering. The teachers asked if everything was okay at home. I lied, because what good would the truth do? Telling them my father thought freezing was a lesson wouldn't change the fact that no one was coming to save me. Nights were the worst. Our old house creaked with drafts, and my bedroom in the basement always ran coldest. My blankets were thin, my mattress lumpy, and I learned to curl into myself like an animal, trying to trap any warmth I could. Sometimes, when Grace complained of being chilly upstairs, my mother would bring her an extra quilt. For me, there were no such gestures. I would hear their laughter drift through the floorboards while I lay awake, my body stiff from the cold, and wonder why my existence felt like a punishment. I wish I could say I forgot about that coat, that as I grew older the memory faded like old snow. But it didn't. It stayed with me through every season, a reminder that my comfort, my needs, my very warmth, meant nothing to the people who were supposed to protect me. It wasn't just about the fabric or the fur trim. It was about what was taken from me, the right to feel safe, the right to believe that I mattered. Every time I saw Grace bundle up in coats bought just for her, every time I heard my father praise her while mocking me, I felt the same bitter wind biting at my skin. I started to see the pattern clearly. When my father said, "Toughen up," what he really meant was suffer quietly. When he said, "You'll thank me someday," he meant, "You'll never expect anything from anyone, least of all me." And it worked. For years, I stopped asking for warmth, both the kind that came from a coat and the kind that came from a father's love. I built myself around the absence, convinced that if I didn't expect kindness, it couldn't hurt me when it never came. But that coat, lying in the trash, was the moment my childhood crystallized into something I could never melt away. It was the day I learned that betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes, it whispers with the crunch of snow under your shoes, the sting of wind on your face, the sight of your sister twirling in pink fur while you shiver alone. Even now, all these years later, when winter comes, I feel it again. The cold that never left me. The memory of my father's smirk as he turned away, leaving me to fend for myself. That was the beginning of the story. A coat in the trash, a girl in the cold, and a lesson burned into me so deeply it would shape everything that came after. If my father's idea of love was to toughen me up, then my mother's was to pretend she didn't see. Her silence was a blanket, but not the kind that warmed you, more like one that smothered. I used to stare at her across the dinner table, hoping she'd say something, anything, when my father's lessons cut me down. But she never did. She stirred her spoon through her stew, eyes fixed on the bowl, as if my pain was just another sound in the house. I learned early that survival in my family meant quiet endurance. My father believed weakness was the only sin, and he never missed a chance to remind me that I carried more of it than anyone. He called it character building. I called it cruelty. When I stumbled on icy mornings, he laughed. When my hands shook from cold, he mocked my clumsy grip. And when I cried, he sneered. "Cry all you want, tears freeze too." Grace never faced those lessons. She had warmth draped over her shoulders in the form of brand new coats, boots that actually fit, and mittens lined with fleece. I remember one Christmas when she unwrapped a glossy pair of leather boots, the kind every girl in school wanted. I had asked for the same thing. Instead, I got socks, 3 sizes too big, bundled together with a ribbon like it was a thoughtful gift. My father grinned as if I should be grateful. Grace strutted around the living room, twirling in her boots while I sat quietly, tugging socks up past my knees and pretending I didn't mind. That was the rhythm of my childhood, her laughter filling the house, my silence pressed into the corners. Grace was the shining daughter, the favorite, the one whose cheeks my father cupped in his hands. I was the shadow, left to figure out how to keep warm when no one cared if I froze. School made the humiliation worse. Clothes mattered there, and mine told the story of neglect more clearly than any words could. My sweaters were stretched thin, my shoes scuffed and splitting at the seams. In the winter, I wore layers of shirts to compensate for the coat I no longer had, but the wind still cut through. "Caroline, are you homeless?" a boy once asked as I walked into class with sleeves that didn't match and jeans frayed at the knees. Laughter rippled across the room, and though the teacher scolded him, the damage was done. I laughed along, pretending it was a joke, but the sting lodged in my chest like a shard of ice. Bullies don't need much to latch onto, and I gave them plenty. The smell of damp clothes that took too long to dry. The way my fingers trembled holding a pencil in January. The pale blue of my lips when we lined up outside for recess. Grace, meanwhile, never suffered those jeers. She was the girl with glossy hair and a bubblegum pink coat, the one who always had extra snacks tucked in her lunch bag. Teachers cooed at her. Friends clung to her. She never had to explain why her hands shook or why her shoes squeaked with melted snow. I kept my head down, swallowing the shame like bitter medicine. Each time someone asked if everything was all right at home, I plastered on a smile. "I'm fine," I'd say. Those words became armor, flimsy but necessary. Because telling the truth, that my father threw away my only coat to make me stronger, that my mother stood by while I shivered, would have only made me seem weaker in his eyes. And weakness was unforgivable. One morning in particular still haunts me. The air was so cold it seemed to scrape my lungs from the inside. I remember stepping outside, the ground glittering with frost, my breath rising in desperate clouds. Grace tugged her hood tight, her face warm behind fur trim. My father smiled at her, adjusting the zipper of her new parka before turning to me. His eyes narrowed at the way I hunched into myself, hands jammed into my thin pockets. "Stand up straight," he snapped. "The cold won't kill you unless you let it." I stood up straight, not because his words made sense, but because I knew defiance would only make things worse. My fingers burned as if dipped in ice water, and every step toward school felt like punishment. By the time I arrived, my legs were stiff. My teeth chattered so loudly I could hardly answer the teacher's roll call. When a classmate asked if I was all right, I forced a smile and whispered, "I'm fine." That lie carried me through childhood. It became second nature. Pretend the cold didn't hurt. Pretend the neglect didn't matter. Pretend I didn't notice the way my sister was swaddled in care while I was stripped of it. Pretend because the truth was too heavy, too humiliating to admit out loud. But deep down, I knew the truth. And with each frigid morning, each night spent under threadbare blankets, a seed began to grow. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, like a coal buried under ash. But it burned all the same. One day, I promised myself I'd never be cold again. Not in body, not in spirit. I would build a life where warmth wasn't rationed out by the whims of people who claimed to love me. I would make sure that when winter came, I'd meet it with walls, blankets, and strength of my own making. I didn't know then how or when it would happen. All I knew was that the frost that surrounded me wasn't just weather, it was family. And if I wanted to survive, I had to grow into something stronger than the cold that raised me. By the time I reached my teenage years, the cold inside our house had changed shape. It wasn't just about shivering in the winter anymore. It was about the way my father looked at me, as though he'd already decided what I was worth. And in his eyes, it wasn't much. "You're soft," he would say, whenever I hesitated at one of his so-called lessons. If I dropped something heavy while helping him in the garage, I was weak. If I asked for help with homework, I was lazy. Every mistake, every falter was proof that I wasn't cut from the same cloth as him, or as Grace, who seemed to glide through life without the burden of his scrutiny. Grace could spill milk at the table, and he'd laugh, ruffle her hair, call her my little princess. If I so much as breathed too loudly, I was told to toughen up, sit straighter, do better. She basked in warmth. I drowned in criticism. The imbalance grew heavier with every passing year until I stopped wondering why and just accepted that I was the designated target. My mother remained silent, always silent. Sometimes, I caught her watching me with something close to guilt in her eyes. But guilt never turned into action. She never stepped between me and my father's barbs, never told him to stop. Her silence taught me another lesson that I was on my own. It was around 14 that I started working, not because I wanted extra spending money like other kids, but because I had no choice. My father refused to buy me new clothes. "You've got 2 hands and legs. Earn it yourself," he said one afternoon when I asked for a pair of jeans that weren't threadbare. Grace got new outfits whenever she asked. For me, the answer was always no, so I took a job cleaning tables at the diner down the street. The hours were long, the pay was small, but it was mine. The first paycheck I brought home felt like more than money. It was freedom in paper form. I bought myself a jacket. It wasn't fancy, just a simple black coat from a thrift store, but slipping into it felt like wrapping myself in defiance. My father sneered when he saw it. "What, you think you're grown now?" he asked, eyes narrowing. "You're still soft. Money won't change that." I didn't answer him, but inside something shifted. I realized that every dollar I earned pulled me 1 inch further away from needing him. Every shift at the diner was another brick in the wall I was building between us. But the ridicule never stopped. If anything, it grew louder the more I tried to step into my own life. My father mocked the way I smelled faintly of grease after work, saying no one respectable would want me. Grace parroted his words, smirking as she lounged on the couch in clothes he'd bought her. My mother said nothing. I washed my uniform at night, hung it on the radiator to dry, and went back again the next day. School became my sanctuary in some ways, though even there, I carried the weight of home. I poured myself into books, into learning, determined to build a path that didn't rely on the family who had already written me off. My grades climbed, my teachers encouraged me, and for the first time, I felt like maybe I could carve out a future that didn't look like the one my father wanted for me. When I told him I wanted to apply to college, he laughed in my face. "College? For what? So you can waste money and come crawling back here when you fail. You don't have what it takes. You'll be better off finding a man to take care of you if you're lucky enough that someone wants you." Those words burned deeper than the winter wind ever had. To him, I was incapable, unworthy, doomed to fail before I even started. He refused to even glance at the brochures I collected from the school counselor. Grace, meanwhile, announced she wanted to be a teacher, and suddenly my father was researching colleges for her, setting aside money for tuition, praising her ambition like it was a crown she wore. I wanted to scream, to demand why she deserved encouragement while I was handed mockery. But I swallowed the words, as I always did. I worked longer hours at the diner, saved every penny I could, and reminded myself that I didn't need his approval to chase my dreams. Still, the distance between us widened until it felt like a canyon. Family dinners turned into battlegrounds of silence and sharp words. Grace would chat about her day, and my father would beam at her like the sun rose just for her. When I spoke, he cut me off with a sigh, as though the sound of my voice itself was an inconvenience. One night, when I mentioned I had been accepted into the honor society, he waved his hand dismissively. "Grades don't mean anything in the real world. You think being smart will keep you warm in the winter. You think it'll put food on the table. You're living in a fantasy, Caroline." I clenched my fists under the table, nails digging into my palms to stop myself from crying. Grace smirked, basking in the attention he gave her. My mother cleared the dishes without meeting my eyes. That was the moment I realized I could achieve everything in the world, and to my father, it would never be enough. But in that realization was a strange kind of freedom. If nothing I did would win his respect, then I no longer needed to try. I could build my life without his voice weighing me down. The thought scared me and thrilled me in equal measure. I began to see a future that belonged to me alone, a future where I didn't measure my worth against Grace's parka or my father's sneer. A future where my warmth didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Of course, I wasn't free yet. I still lived under his roof, still endured his lessons about toughness, still carried the sting of every insult. But the seeds of independence had taken root. I was working. I was saving. I was dreaming. And with every step I took, the distance between me and my family grew. I told myself that one day, when I finally walked away, I wouldn't look back. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they had broken me. I would leave with my head held high, my own warmth wrapped tightly around me, proof that I had survived their cold. What I didn't know then was how deep the betrayal would go, how sharp the mockery would become when they realized I wouldn't follow the path they laid out for me. I thought I had already endured the worst of it. I thought the cold had already taught me all it could. But I was wrong. The bitterest winters were still ahead. Every child has a breaking point, and mine came the year I turned 17. By then, the cold in my father's house had seeped into every corner of my life. His voice was a constant drumbeat of "you're not enough," and his eyes carried a permanent sneer whenever they landed on me. For years, I swallowed it down, told myself it was normal, told myself I could outlast it. But something inside me snapped the day he threw my acceptance letter into the fireplace. I had worked for months on that application. Essays written at the diner counter between shifts, recommendations from teachers who believed in me, grades I clawed my way toward while juggling exhaustion. When the thick envelope arrived, I tore it open with shaking hands. I was in. A full scholarship to the state university. Proof that I wasn't as worthless as he said. Proof that I had a future. I showed it to him, my heart pounding, waiting for some flicker of pride. He scanned the first line, then tossed it into the fire. The paper curled and blackened while I stood frozen. "College is a waste," he said flatly. "You'll just end up failing. Better you learn now than waste everyone's time." I can still smell the smoke, still hear the crackle as my dream went up in flames. That was the moment I knew if I stayed under his roof, I would wither. He wanted me to shrink, to accept that my life belonged to his definition of toughness. But I wanted more, and for the first time I realized I had to take it myself. That night, in the basement bedroom where my breath fogged in the air, I made a vow. I would not beg him for warmth again. The next day, I confided in the only person I trusted, Miss Alvarez, my English teacher. She was the first adult who ever looked me in the eye and said, "Caroline, you are meant for more than this town." She saw past the second-hand clothes, the tired eyes, the way I tried to disappear. She saw me. When I told her what had happened with my father, she placed her hand over mine and said, "They don't get to decide your worth. You already earned this, and if you want it badly enough, we'll find another way." She became my flame against the frost. She helped me file appeals, track down alternative scholarships, and even slipped me money for bus fare when I couldn't cover it. She coached me through interviews, lent me books to expand my mind, and reminded me with every conversation that my life didn't have to mirror the cold house I grew up in. At the same time, I worked harder than ever. The diner became more than a job. It became my lifeline. Every tip, every crumpled dollar, went into a savings jar hidden beneath my mattress. When my father asked why I worked so much, I told him it was to keep myself out of trouble. The truth was, I was building an escape route. The ridicule at home only intensified. Grace teased me about smelling like fried food. My father called me a slave to pennies, and my mother stood silent. But with every insult, my resolve hardened. They thought they were breaking me. In reality, they were forging me into something they could no longer control. Slowly, I pieced together the scaffolding of a future. By senior year, I had secured a scholarship from a regional women's foundation that covered not just tuition, but housing. Miss Alvarez connected me with an alumna who offered me part-time work on campus. And thanks to the diner, I had a small cushion of savings to carry me through emergencies. For the first time, I felt something new stirring inside me, stability. It wasn't loud or flashy. I didn't announce it at the dinner table. I carried it like a secret flame, warming me quietly while my father continued to sneer. Grace still basked in the spotlight. She bragged about her own college plans, funded entirely by my father. He boasted about her future to relatives, proudly calling her the smart one. He never once mentioned my scholarship. To him, my successes weren't real unless he had paid for them. But that was fine. Let him ignore me. Let him believe I was still the shadow in the basement. He didn't need to know that every week I was weaving a safety net strong enough to hold me. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined the future I was building. A small apartment with heat that never faltered. A closet full of coats I bought myself, lined up like soldiers guarding me from the past. A bank account with enough to ensure I never had to beg anyone for necessities. Maybe even a little house of my own one day, with walls that held warmth instead of silence. Those dreams kept me alive through the final winter at home. My father's voice still cut me down, but it no longer pierced me the way it once had. I had armor now, grades, scholarships, savings, allies. The cold still nipped at my skin, but inside a fire was burning that he couldn't extinguish. The day I moved out for college, he didn't even say goodbye. He stood on the porch with arms crossed, watching me load my thrift store suitcases into a borrowed car. My mother wiped her hands on a dish towel, avoiding my gaze. Grace smirked, wrapped in a new coat he had just bought her. I paused, taking in the image of the house where I had learned the meaning of cold. For a moment, I thought I might cry, but instead I smiled, small but steady. Because I knew that from that moment forward, I belonged to myself. I didn't tell them about the scholarships. I didn't tell them about Miss Alvarez, or the job waiting for me on campus, or the savings jar that had grown fat beneath my mattress. I didn't tell them that I had already started researching investments, reading about ways to turn pennies into dollars, dollars into independence. Those secrets were mine, and mine alone. As the car pulled away, I whispered the vow again under my breath, a promise carved into the marrow of my bones. I will never beg him for warmth again. Adulthood was supposed to free me from the cold, but in many ways my family carried it with them like a shadow. By the time I finished school and started working, I thought I had put enough miles between us to finally breathe. I had a steady job, a one-bedroom apartment with heat that never clicked off, and a growing savings account that no one but me knew about. I built routines, carved out small joys, and for the first time in my life, I was warm. But my family had a way of finding cracks. The phone calls started first. They never began with, "How are you?" or "We miss you," always with a demand. Grace wanted money for new textbooks. My father wanted me to chip in for house repairs, even though I no longer lived there. My mother's voice, soft and strained, asked if I could help out just this once. It was never just once. When I hesitated, my father's anger crackled down the line. "Don't be ungrateful. We raised you, didn't we? You owe us." Raised me. That was the word he used, as if neglect counted as raising, as if cruelty was the same as care. Still, I bit my tongue. I sent small amounts here and there, never enough to wound my own stability, but enough to quiet their voices for a time. But it was never enough. The mocking came next. Grace called to brag about her new car, bought by my father. Then, almost in the same breath, she asked why I hadn't settled down yet, or landed something real. My father cut in during family dinners over the phone, scoffing at the work I was doing. "You're what now, an assistant? That's not a career. That's waiting around until someone important notices you. Don't act like you're special. You're still the same soft kid I had to toughen up." The words sliced through me, even from miles away. I could have defended myself. Could have told him about the promotions I had earned, the side projects I was building, the investments slowly stacking in my account. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, swallowing my pride like medicine gone bitter. Because silence, I realized, was its own weapon. The humiliation reached its peak one evening when I visited for Grace's birthday dinner. I had almost convinced myself not to go, but some part of me still hoped for recognition, still longed for a shred of acknowledgement. The house was filled with relatives, uncles, cousins, neighbors. Laughter hummed in the air, coats hung by the door. When I walked in, the room stilled for a moment. I wasn't the golden child. I was the reminder of what my father deemed failure. I sat quietly, watching Grace open gifts, her smile dazzling as everyone showered her with praise. Then my father stood, glass in hand, and cleared his throat. "I just want to say how proud I am of Grace," he announced. "She's accomplished so much already. A real career, a real future. Not like some people who waste their time on little jobs and think it makes them grown." The room laughed. I felt the heat creep up my neck as every eye flicked toward me. My father smirked, raising his glass higher. "Some people never learn toughness," he said. "Some people will always be fragile. You can't build a house on ice." Ice. That was his word for me. Fragile, cracking, doomed to melt. I sat frozen, a smile plastered on my face to mask the fire raging inside. I wanted to stand up, to scream that I wasn't fragile, that I had built a life warmer and stronger than he could ever imagine. But instead, I swallowed it. Let him believe I was powerless, because the truth was, power doesn't always need to announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Quiet, patient, hidden under the surface until the right moment arrives. So I let him have his performance. Let him raise his glass and laugh at me in front of the family. Let Grace bask in her spotlight while cousins whispered and uncles shook their heads. I stayed silent, holding my tongue until it bled. What they didn't know was that silence was not surrender. I had been building something they couldn't see. Every extra shift, every scholarship, every dollar tucked away had been the bricks of my escape. I had investments growing quietly, a savings account solid, and a career path that stretched further than they could fathom. I owned things they didn't know about, small but steady steps toward independence, toward wealth, toward a future beyond their reach. But I told no one. To them, I remained the fragile daughter, the weak one, the disappointment. They believed I would stumble, fail, and come crawling back, and I let them believe it. Because nothing would taste sweeter than the day the truth revealed itself without me saying a word. As I sat there at Grace's birthday, their laughter echoing around me, I felt something settle deep inside. Not despair, not shame, but ice. Ice in the blood, steady and strong. If they thought they could humiliate me into weakness, they didn't understand what kind of woman I had become. I didn't rise from their neglect by accident. I rose because of it. I carried their cold in my veins, but instead of freezing me, it made me unbreakable. That night, I left the house without saying goodbye. My father's laughter followed me out the door, but I didn't flinch. I drove back to my apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The heater kicked on, filling the air with warmth, and I smiled. Let them think I was powerless. Let them believe I would always be the shadow in their house. Because the truth was already written, one day they would stand outside my door, shivering. And when that day came, they would finally understand the cost of underestimating me. The day I signed the papers for my first home, I cried. But not because anyone was there to celebrate with me. No father to beam proudly, no mother to whisper she was proud, no sister to help me carry boxes through the doorway. The tears came because the keys in my hand were proof. Proof that I had survived the cold, that I had carved something from nothing. The house wasn't grand. A modest 2-story tucked into a quiet neighborhood with a porch that creaked when I stepped on it and a yard that needed trimming. But it was mine. Every wall, every shingle, every window was paid for with nights at the diner, scholarships won, jobs worked, promotions earned. No one could take it from me. And most importantly, the heat was mine to control. I set the thermostat to 70, let the warmth hum through the vents, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly safe. I filled the rooms slowly. Second-hand furniture, thrifted curtains, shelves stacked with books I had longed to own. No one else would have seen the beauty in it, but I did. Because it wasn't just a house. It was dignity. It was independence in brick and wood. It was proof that I no longer had to beg for a place at anyone's table. Meanwhile, the fortress of my father's pride began to crumble. At first, I heard whispers. His business contracts fell through. He lost clients who had once trusted his bluster. The man who spent years preaching about toughness and self-reliance found himself scrambling. He was laid off, reduced to short-term gigs that barely covered the bills. Grace, who had always been shielded by his wallet, began to slip as well, her new car repossessed, her apartment rent overdue. For years, they mocked me for working long hours and saving pennies. Now those pennies had built me a life of stability, while their arrogance left them exposed to the cold. I wish I could say I felt triumphant right away, but the truth is, part of me ached to hear it. My mother's voice cracked over the phone as she explained how hard things had become. Grace left rambling messages about needing a little help to get back on her feet. My father, proud as ever, refused to admit weakness, but his silence spoke volumes. Then came the night they showed up at my door. It was bitter outside, the kind of winter that cut straight through bone. Snow clung to the edges of their coats, their breaths rising in quick, desperate puffs. Grace hugged herself tightly, her lips tinged blue. My mother looked thinner than I remembered, her cheeks hollow. And behind them stood my father, still trying to stand tall, but I saw the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched against the cold. "Caroline," my mother whispered, her voice raw. We need help." Grace shivered violently, eyes darting to the glow of warmth spilling through my windows. "Your house looks nice," she said through chattering teeth, as if admitting that cost her more than the cold itself. My father said nothing at first. His silence was different now, heavy and bitter. Finally, he muttered, "We didn't think it would come to this." I stood in the doorway, the heat from inside brushing against my back, the icy wind biting at my face. I remembered every night I spent freezing in that basement, every walk to school with numb fingers, every laugh at my expense. I remembered the crackle of my acceptance letter burning in the fireplace. I remembered him standing tall while I stood small, and now here he was, smaller than I had ever seen him, shivering on my doorstep. They thought I would crumble in that moment. They thought I would fling the door wide, usher them into the warmth, desperate for their approval at last. They thought I was still the girl who whispered, "I'm fine," while freezing inside. But I wasn't. I had built this life without them. Every beam, every dollar, every ounce of warmth was mine. They hadn't lifted a finger, hadn't offered a kind word, hadn't believed in me for a single moment. And now they expected me to save them, to forget everything just because their world had collapsed. I let the silence stretch. My father shifted uncomfortably, his breath coming out in sharp bursts. Grace rubbed her arms furiously, muttering that she couldn't feel her fingers. My mother gave me a pleading look, but I felt nothing stir in me. Not the old ache, not the desperate hunger for approval, just calm. "Funny," I said at last, my voice steady. "You always told me the cold wouldn't kill me unless I let it. Looks like you're learning that lesson now." My father's head snapped up, eyes blazing with something between anger and shame. For the first time, he had no retort. I didn't invite them in. Not yet. I let them stand there, teeth chattering, feet stamping against the ice. I let them feel what I had felt for years, unwanted, unwelcome, left to freeze while warmth sat just beyond reach. Because justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's as simple as turning the tables. That night marked the beginning of the end. My father's pride had carried him through decades, but pride doesn't pay bills, and pride doesn't keep you warm in winter. His downfall had only just begun, and mine, the rise he never saw coming, was ready to unfold. As I closed the door, leaving them on the porch for just a moment longer, I thought, this is what it feels like when the winter finally turns. And deep inside, I prepared myself. The ultimate reversal was coming, and when it arrived, there would be no going back. The night it all came full circle was colder than any I remembered. The kind of cold that froze the air in your lungs, that turned breath into mist the moment it left your lips. I stood in the doorway of my home, my hand resting against the frame, and stared at the figure on my porch. My father. He was hunched, shoulders drawn tight against the wind, a thin jacket clinging to him like paper. His cheeks were red, his lips cracked and blue. His hands, those hands that once gripped my shoulders too tightly, that once tossed my only coat into the trash, were trembling, rubbed raw by the bite of winter. Behind him stood my mother, wringing her hands, and Grace, who looked away every time our eyes met. For a moment, it felt like time had folded back on itself. I wasn't standing in my own home. I was 10 years old again, watching my coat sail into a snowbank, shivering so hard I could barely think. The cold I felt then was the same cold I saw in his eyes now. And yet, how different it felt to be on the other side of the door. "Caroline," he said, his voice hoarse, we need shelter, just for the night." The words nearly startled me. This was the man who never asked, only demanded. The man who believed weakness was a sin, who called me fragile, unworthy, useless. And here he was asking, begging. Grace shifted on her feet, her arms wrapped around herself. My mother murmured something about the pipes bursting at their house, about the heat being cut off, about how they had nowhere else to go. But all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. I stepped forward, just enough so they could feel the warmth rushing out behind me. My father's eyes flicked past me, into the house, drinking in the sight of glowing lamps, of a fire crackling in the hearth, of everything I had built without him. "You remember?" I asked softly, my voice carrying over the wind. "The night you threw my coat away, said I didn't need it, said the cold would toughen me up." His jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. "I remember," I continued. "Every shiver, every time I begged for warmth and you laughed, every walk to school with frozen hands. Every night in that basement while Grace slept upstairs in comfort." Grace looked at the ground. My mother pressed her lips tight, but my father, he tried to stand straighter, though the cold bent him back down. "That was different," he muttered. "You were a child, I was teaching you." "Teaching me what?" I asked, my voice steady. "That love is conditional, that survival is a game. That I would never be enough for you." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. My father's breath hitched. His pride battled his desperation, and I watched the war play out on his face. But desperation won. "Please," he said, his voice breaking in a way I never thought possible. "Let us in." The word "please" from his mouth should have been satisfying, and in a way it was. But more than that, it was clarifying. I saw him not as a towering force anymore, not as the giant shadow who had shaped my childhood. I saw him for what he was, a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength, and now stood broken in front of me, begging for the very warmth he had denied me. Neighbors had begun to notice. Lights flicked on across the street, curtains shifted. One man stepped onto his porch, watching curiously as the scene unfolded. Grace's face flushed when she realized people were looking. My father, too proud to acknowledge the audience, tried to square his shoulders again, but his legs shook with the effort. The irony wasn't lost on me. Once he had humiliated me in front of relatives, mocking my ambitions, calling me fragile. Now he stood humiliated before strangers, trembling on my porch, exposed for the man he really was. I let the silence stretch. Let the cold bite at their skin the same way it had bitten mine for years. Let them feel what it was like to stand on the outside looking in. Finally, I spoke. "I built this house without you. Every brick, every dollar, every ounce of warmth inside. It's mine. You mocked me for being weak, but I made it here without a single bit of your help. And now you want me to save you. My father's eyes met mine, wide and desperate. For the first time, there was no superiority in them, only fear. You taught me a lesson, remember? I said quietly. That the cold won't kill you unless you let it. Tonight, it's your turn to learn what that really means. I stepped back into the doorway, the heat wrapping around me like a shield. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my hand on the edge of the door. My father took a half step forward, his lips parting as if to protest. But I didn't wait for him to speak. I closed the door. The latch clicked, the sound final and steady. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. I stood still for a long moment, my heart pounding, my breath steady. Through the window, I saw them still standing there, my father's pride unraveling in front of the neighbors, Grace shifting uncomfortably, my mother's eyes full of something that looked a lot like regret. The cold had returned, but this time it wasn't mine to endure. I turned away, walking deeper into the house I had built, the house that was mine alone. The warmth followed me, filling every corner, every empty space that once belonged to grief. For the first time, I felt peace. Not the kind that begs for reconciliation, but the kind that comes when justice is finally served. Let him shiver. Let him learn. The frost that once nearly destroyed me was now his to carry. The night I closed the door on my father, I thought I might feel guilty. Some small part of me worried that I would wake the next morning drowning in doubt, second-guessing the choice to let him stand in the same cold he once forced on me. But when dawn broke, sunlight streamed through the windows of my own home, casting warmth across the hardwood floors, and I felt nothing but clarity. I brewed coffee in a kitchen that was mine, sat at a table bought with my own earnings, and watched the steam rise from the mug. That steam was more than comfort. It was proof. Proof that I had built a life where warmth no longer depended on anyone else. For so long, I carried the frost of my childhood in my bones. I thought it defined me, thought I would always be that shivering girl in the basement, waiting for permission to be seen, to be warmed, to be loved. But standing in my own house, I finally realized the truth. I was no longer cold. My warmth didn't come from family, from the people who should have given it freely but chose cruelty instead. My warmth came from every night I worked myself tired, from every dollar I saved in silence, from every door I pushed open when they tried to slam it shut. It came from the faith Miss Alvarez once had in me, and from the unshakable fire I kept alive when no one else believed. And that fire had grown into something steady, something permanent. My life was no longer measured by what I lacked, but by what I had created. I filled my home with the little things I once dreamed about, books stacked high on shelves, blankets folded neatly on couches, photographs of places I had traveled to on my own. The kind of warmth I craved as a child lived in every detail. My father's downfall continued quietly after that night. His pride, once a weapon, became his cage. Neighbors whispered about the scene at my doorstep, about how the man who preached toughness had been humbled in the cold. Grace drifted in and out, still chasing comfort she hadn't earned. My mother's silence remained, but it no longer bound me, because I was free. The frost of my past would always be a part of me, yes, but no longer as chains. Now it was simply the backdrop to my story, the contrast that made the fire of my own making burn brighter. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the girl shivering in a basement. I saw a woman who survived, who endured, who built a life out of the scraps they left behind. I saw a woman who had learned that family is not always the source of love, and that sometimes you have to choose yourself even if it means standing alone. Justice was served. My father felt the cold he once forced upon me. My family learned that the warmth they denied me could not be reclaimed with begging. But beyond justice, I found something greater. I found peace. Not the kind that waits for apologies that will never come, not the kind that bargains for crumbs of affection. True peace, the kind that comes from knowing I am enough, with or without them. I no longer carry their cruelty in my heart. The bitterness that once weighed me down has melted away. In its place is freedom, dignity, and a quiet joy that no one can take from me. The cold is no longer mine to bear. It is his. And as for me, I live each day in warmth of my own making, unshakable, unyielding, untouchable. Justice was served, but most importantly, I finally found peace. What would you have done if the same father who left you freezing begged at your door years later?